Well, good afternoon. I'm wearing today the tie of the Art Academy of Cincinnati. As we work through this coronavirus, we're going to continue to see hotspots flare up in different communities, in different counties. There is one that is occurring now. It has occurred in Clark County. This has to do with the Dole food processing plant. So far, over 200 people who work there have tested positive. I bring this up because I want to make it very clear to all the health departments in the state of Ohio that we are here to help. If you have a situation like that, or a situation where there's a real hot spot where we're seeing a lot of individuals come down, people, our citizens come down with the virus, we are here to try to help. So, for example, in Clark County, we are helping with the tracing. We are also helping with interpreters to be able to talk with individuals who have come down with the virus. We are also asking our Zone 3 health partners, the hospitals, to become involved and to help as well. So this is the type of help that we at the State Health Department can do. In regard to tracers, we have hired approximately 100 new tracers. Again, when a health department gets a hot spot, we can have those tracers back them up and assist them. The other thing that I would urge all our health departments around the state is to continue on the hiring of the new tracers. I know that you have people who are already employed who are doing this, but we're going to continue to see spikes in different places, and it's important to be ready to tackle that. But again, we're there as a backup. We're there to give you help. This is the way, the testing, the tracing, this is the way we can be on the offense in regard to the coronavirus. Very, very, very important that we do this as we move forward. I would like to thank Attorney General Dave Yost for being with us today. Dave, thank you very, very much for being here. And I will speak first, and then the Attorney General will speak, and then we'll go to questions from the news media. The death of Mr. Floyd and the subsequent protests, demonstrations, and the violence have appeared really to lay bare some of our deep divisions in this country. Over the last several weeks, I've heard from many people with different views. It strikes me, though, that many of these views are really not that far apart, and they're not mutually inconsistent. One can certainly believe that protests are appropriate and, in fact, needed, but also believe that violence is wrong and that violence is counterproductive. One can believe that the protests are good, but also that protesters should practice social distancing and wear masks to protect themselves and others, and many did. Some, unfortunately, did not. One can believe that most police men and women are dedicated public servants who risk their lives every single day to protect us. And also believe that there are some officers that should not be police officers. With the divisions that we have seen, we continue to see, it is important that we take every opportunity to pull together, because what unites us is so much stronger than what divides us. All of us, no matter the color of our skin or the way we worship, are so much more alike than we are different. The citizens rallying across this state, all but a fraction, are good people who want change, good people who don't want violence. They want to be heard. They want to be treated equally. They want to feel safe in society. They want everyone to be treated equally. Our law enforcement officers, all but a fraction, are good people who risk their lives for us each and every day. During the demonstrations in Ohio, we saw occasions where police officers, deputies marched beside demonstrators and joined in prayer circles. We've seen when demonstrators took a knee in protest in Columbus, we saw some law enforcement officers kneel as well. And there are other examples. The truth is that for the last few years, many law enforcement agencies across the state have worked hard to improve their community police relations and to enhance public trust. Many agencies have done a great job, and we must and we should acknowledge that. We must also, though, acknowledge that there are some officers in Ohio who just are not cut out to be in law enforcement. And they have no place being in a position of trust. We must do more to make sure that officers who lack that professionalism and who show racial bias, who are biased, are not wearing a badge in the state of Ohio. Last week I told you about our initial plans for meaningful police reform in Ohio, including the development of a new standard throughout the state for law enforcement's response to mass protests. We're working to get uniformity and get a best practice in place. We also talked about enhanced efforts to ensure more law enforcement agencies meet Ohio's standards for that use of force. Last week, I also announced the creation of a new Office of Law Enforcement Recruitment to help improve the representation of minorities and women in law enforcement agencies. This new office will develop and share best practices on the hiring of candidates who are best suited for this great career. It will assist agencies looking to hire more minorities and to hire more women. I'm pleased to announce this afternoon that Dr. Patrick Oliver, who currently serves as the director of the Criminal Justice Program at Cedarville University, has agreed to serve as the lead consultant to this office. Dr. Oliver served for 27 years in law enforcement, including 11 years as a trooper with the Ohio State Highway Patrol. And he has served as the police chief in Fairborn, Grandview Heights, Cleveland, and as the ranger chief of the Cleveland Metropolitan Parks. We're very grateful to work with Dr. Oliver. I've worked with him in the past, and he will be a great addition. The steps announced last week are steps that I could take immediately as your governor. But many of the other things that need to be done take legislative action, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We've been talking with many members of the legislature, talked with Representative Phil Plummer, Representative Cindy Abrams, about the bill that they unveiled last week on law enforcement reform. And I look forward to working with them and all members of the General Assembly. This morning I spoke again with members of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus. I listened to their concerns. I told them some of the things that I would be outlining to you today. And let me just say, in regard to them and to other members of the General Assembly and to anyone who is watching out there today, this is a process. This is not just go do something and then move on. This is a process, and we must all commit to staying with that process for many, many months and many, many years ahead. Many of the things that I will outline today have been part of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus's agenda for some period of time. The ultimate goal that I believe we all should share is to improve law enforcement accountability, training, and transparency. Accountability, training, transparency, and in that way, we can build public trust in law enforcement. Let me start with the first item. Today I'm asking the members of the General Assembly to require that before a person can begin training to become a law enforcement officer in the state of Ohio, they must first pass a psychological test showing that they are fit to be an officer. Law enforcement training is something that I've been working on for many years. As Ohio's Attorney General, I formed an advisory group in 2014 to examine how Ohio trained its officers and to help improve the process. As a result, Ohio added more than 100 hours to its basic training, and that was a needed improvement. 100 additional hours to basic training, and that included required training on implicit bias for all the cadets. We also strengthened our standards for those applying to a police academy. Applicants now must have a high school diploma. Amazingly, that was not a requirement, or a GED. That was not a requirement before. They must pass a drug screen, and there are more criminal disqualifiers as well. The concept of adding a psychological exam was also recommended by my Attorney General's Advisory Group on Law Enforcement Training. We must really condition this to Ohio's basic training to help us prevent tragedies in the future. This should occur. The taking of this test should occur prior to the beginning of the work at the academy. Ohio must make sure that only those with the right psychological makeup are admitted to the police academy and eventually issued a peace officer's certificate. Following a cadet's graduation from basic training, but before issuing a peace officer certificate, the Ohio Peace Officers Training Commission will, under our proposal, check references and take other critical steps to further ensure the candidate possesses the appropriate character, fitness, and temperament to be certified police officer in the state of Ohio. Second, I'm also announcing today that through the Ohio Department of Public Safety's Office of Criminal Justice Services, we will fund this year, 2020, 6 additional hours of de-escalation training. This de-escalation training will include helping law enforcement officers understand people who have a mental health condition, people who have a drug or alcohol dependency issue. This will include use of force training, implicit bias training. These hours will be offered free to any law enforcement officer in the state of Ohio who has not already received this training in the year 2020. When I was Attorney General, our advisory group recommended an increase in the number of advanced training hours required for all Ohio officers. In response, I worked with the General Assembly to find money to pay for advanced training for every law enforcement officer in the state, 11 additional hours in 2016 and 20 in 2017, on topics such as crisis de-escalation, constitutional use of force, implicit bias, and others. There has not, however, been any required advanced training for officers in this state since. That was the last years that I was in office and continues to today. So we have to rectify that. With the exception of annual firearm requalification training, current state law prohibits Ohio from mandating advanced training unless Ohio pays for it. Some local agencies do pay for their own training if their budget allows, but not all agencies can afford this additional training, which means that some officers go years without any additional training. This is simply unacceptable. We as a state must do all that we can to ensure that all of our police officers, regardless of whether they serve in a big city, a suburb, small village, have the knowledge and skills to properly protect the public. I've never met a law enforcement officer who did not want more training. And because they understand the importance of that training. Let me say again, no matter where an Ohio citizen lives, they deserve to be served by officers who receive a set number of advanced training hours each year. So today I'm asking the Ohio General Assembly to start a discussion with me, with the Attorney General, and with the public to find a permanent funding stream for law enforcement training so that Ohio can have that specific training every single year for police officers in the state. Again, it is a patchwork. It is very uneven. Most of the major cities, if not all of the major cities, have that additional training. Some have their own police academy. Some have a physical academy. but there are hundreds and hundreds of smaller departments around the state who have not been able to afford that additional training for their officers each year. We have to find a permanent funding source to deal with that. Number 3, use of force data. Transparency in law enforcement is obviously critically important. Today I'm asking the General Assembly to create a standard definition of use of force and to mandate that all agencies in the state report information on these incidents. Every time there is a use of force, that should be reported to the state, to the Office of Criminal Justice Services. Right now, unfortunately, we do not have a holistic picture of how often use of force happens in Ohio, let alone if the force was justified or excessive. This data simply is not tracked across the state, and we must begin to do that. I am today directing the Office of Criminal Justice Services to begin developing a public database to house this information. I fully intend to make submitted information then available to the public. This information should be more than just statistics. It should also include public incident reports and other supporting information to allow for a better understanding of each and every incident. The Ohio Criminal Justice Services already collects extensive data from local law enforcement. They're used to doing this. In fact, just this month, they added a new feature to their website that allows the public to look at data on certain violent crimes and property crimes from reporting agencies across the state. Police data related to use of force will not only provide transparency for all Ohio citizens, but will also improve our understanding of why these incidents happen so that we can proactively work to prevent them in the future. If you don't know the facts, it's difficult to make judgments, it's difficult to make corrections. We will be able to identify situations that most often lead to force so that we can offer de-escalation training specifically related to the scenarios that we find to be most common. Let me talk about chokeholds. I'm asking the legislature to ban this maneuver across the state of Ohio unless it is determined that the officer was justified in using deadly force. So only in those rare cases where the officer's life is in danger or where the officer is taking action to protect another individual from losing their life. 2, the only time this chokehold should be used is in life or death situations, when an officer is fighting for his or her life or protecting the life of someone else. I've asked all of our executive branch agencies with a law enforcement component, Department of Public Safety, for example, the Highway Patrol, the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, our prisons, our Department of Youth Services, to examine their use of force policies as they relate to chokeholds and to comply with what I just outlined. Next, today I'm calling on the General Assembly to mandate an independent investigation for all officer-involved shootings and all in-custody deaths. It's time for this process to become automatic and mandatory for every law enforcement agency in Ohio, big and small. When I served as Attorney General, Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, was and still under Attorney General Dave Yost, is often requested to act as an outside independent agency to do an investigation, to investigate serious officer-involved incidents, to avoid the perception of any impropriety. But requesting BCI or any other outside agency is not necessarily mandatory. It's not mandatory, meaning some agencies do investigate their own officers. Simply put, law enforcement agencies should not be investigating themselves. Even if they do a great job, there is still the appearance of impropriety. There is the appearance, and people may not trust the outcome. Even if an agency's internal affairs unit conducts these investigations strictly by the book, there can still be the perception that investigators are covering for their coworkers and their friends. The concept of internally investigating incidents involving serious harm or death is frankly outdated, and it needs to end. It does not inspire the public trust that is so, so very, very important. Be it BCI or another qualified neutral agency, outside investigators should always be called in to investigate every incident, every time. Now let me turn to independent prosecutions. I'm also asking the legislature to require the independent prosecution of all officer-involved shootings, in-custody deaths, and incidents that lead to serious physical harm. Even though our elected prosecutors are perfectly capable of handling these matters, they do work closely with the local law enforcement agencies in their counties. So the perception of impropriety can certainly exist. Independent prosecutions will help give the public more faith in the process, and it just makes sense to have an outside independent prosecutor assigned to these types of cases. In that same spirit, I want to talk now about Ohio State Highway Patrol investigations. Traditionally, the Ohio State Highway Patrol has been one of those agencies that investigates their use of force incidents themselves. I am announcing today that I have directed the Ohio State Highway Patrol to no longer investigate these incidents, but to ask the Attorney General's office to do that, to ask the Bureau of Criminal Investigation to do those investigations. And I've talked with the Attorney General, and he has agreed to do that. We certainly do have a professional and good internal investigation team at the Highway Patrol, and I'm not aware of any problems with any of their investigations since I've become governor. But this is still something that I believe we must do. Let me talk about body cameras. I'm also want to talk about the body cameras. First of all, our goal should be to ensure that every police officer in the state of Ohio has a body camera. Many do, some do not. We must work to make sure that that happens. I am directing Tom Stickrath, our Director of the Department of Public Safety, and Colonel Richard Fambro, the Ohio State Highway Patrol, to begin outfitting our troopers throughout the state, our Highway Patrol, with body cameras. Today, troopers have cameras on their cruisers, but the use of body cameras by law enforcement is a best practice and is essential for transparency purposes that our troopers use these as well as police officers. I'm asking the legislature to examine what help the state can provide to other local agencies in regard to body cameras. I know that we not only have an expense with body cameras, but it's also been brought to my attention by many of the mayors in the state that the storage of the information, this footage, can also be very expensive. And so we are looking at that to see what we can do to be of help, and I've asked the General Assembly to do the same thing. Let me now talk about the professional licensing of police officers. Today I'm asking our General Assembly to create a law enforcement oversight and accountability board, including members of the law enforcement community and also members of the public. We must begin treating our law enforcement officers like we treat those in other professions. They are truly professionals, and we need to treat them that way. Doctors, dentists, lawyers, barbers, those and many other occupations are held to high professional standards, often with a code of ethics. They report to oversight boards, and if they don't follow the established professional standards, their licenses can be suspended or those licenses can be revoked. Now, under current law, an officer can be fired from one agency for racial profiling, let's say, for lack of professionalism, or for simply just not doing their job. But that officer can keep his or her certificate and can carry on this behavior when they're hired somewhere else. And the sad truth is that many times the new agency does not know the background of that particular officer. Again, the vast majority of our officers do a bang-up job. They're out there protecting us each and every day. They're the ones who get the angriest when they see an officer who is not doing what they should be doing. The only way the state can revoke a peace officer's certificate today is if that officer is convicted of a felony. There's no mechanism in Ohio to revoke a certificate for conduct that might be bad, might be horrible, but is not necessarily criminal. Now it is the time, I believe, to begin treating peace officer certificates more like licenses. And in fact, they should be licenses. This board that I'm referring to, which would be under the Ohio Peace Officers Training Commission, would work with law enforcement experts from across the state and the country to establish standards and a code of conduct for Ohio's law enforcement as a profession. The board would then be responsible for ensuring that Ohio's law enforcement officials adhered to this professional code of conduct. And if not, they would have the authority to suspend and revoke a peace officer's license when necessary. This is similar to the way other professional licensed professions are treated, including physicians and including lawyers. Those within the law enforcement community who fail to report violations by other officers would also be able to be disciplined. In many professions today, if a lawyer, for example, sees another lawyer, or a judge sees a lawyer who is doing things that they should not be doing, violating the code of professional conduct, there's an affirmative obligation on that person, on that lawyer, to report that. Same way with the doctor. This is an obligation that I believe police officers should have as well. Let me now turn it to the Attorney General. Dave, thank you for coming very much, and we're anxious to hear your comments as well.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you for your leadership in this area. I'd like to begin by watching a 58-second video and making a quick comment, because there's been a great deal of discussion about racism and what it is and isn't, and systemic or residual or deliberate or unintended. And I'd like to make a couple of comments that are germane to this discussion, but let's watch this 58-second video that some of you may have seen already.
Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't put your hoodie on. Don't be outside with no shirt on. Check in with your people. It don't matter even if you're down the street. Don't be out too late. Don't touch anything you're not buying. Never leave the store without a receipt or a bag, even if it's just a pack of gum. Never make it look like there's an altercation between you and someone else. Never leave the house without your ID. Don't drive with a wife beater on. Don't drive with a do-rag on. Don't go out in public with neither. Don't ride with the music too loud. Don't stare at a Caucasian woman. If a cop stop you randomly and start questioning you, don't talk back, just compromise. If you ever get pulled over, hands on the dashboard, and ask, could you get out your license and registration?
That video was an excerpt of the the lessons that his mom taught him, a young man. And a question that I would ask all of us, and especially those of us in the majority community, did your mom teach you those lessons? Did you have rules growing up that assumed that you start out a suspect, or that the fabric of life is unjust? This is not a law enforcement problem. This is a societal problem that has a law enforcement dimension. Police are servant heroes. Exceptions to that general rule have not been dealt with in our society, and this is the hour for that to stop. Governor, I have had several conversations in the last few weeks, and our teams have been working close together. I'm supportive of his ideas. Guiding principles for me begin with legitimacy in a government that is a self-government by, for, and of the people. It starts with legitimacy. Do people accept that most of the time the processes are fair, that disputes are fairly heard, that the same rules apply to everybody? for a significant part of our population, the black community. That's not the case. We need to have independence in investigations and prosecutions. No more do-it-yourself investigations. I think the rules apply to everybody. I keep saying that. They apply to BCI too. And if our agents have, God forbid, one of these incidents, Governor, we're going to ask you to have the Highway Patrol unit that you mentioned that's very highly qualified to do an independent investigation in our shop as well, because independence is a bedrock principle that cannot be compromised. And finally, we've got to be able to get rid of the few bad cops. I want to talk for just a moment to my brothers and sisters who wear the badge. Those bad cops, and you know who they are, they're making your job and your mission harder. Those few bad cops are putting your life in jeopardy. They're making you less safe on the street. They're why you're being painted with the same broad brush. I talked to a sheriff earlier this morning in a medium-sized county. And he said, "Dave, I'm just so tired of being kicked around for, people that, those aren't my officers. Those aren't my deputies that are doing this, and we're tired of all law enforcement being painted with the same broad brush. Help us get this legislation passed. Help us to get rid of those few bad cops that are making your lives more difficult. We need the good cops to stand up for justice." Now, I want to mention a few things just on the governor's proposals, a few of them. Many people are not familiar with BCI's officer-involved shooting investigators, and I got to say, there's some really good people out there in local agencies that do this work. We have a great unit in Columbus that does solid work. And this isn't about the competency of any individual unit or any individual officer. It's about independence. It's about legitimacy. It's about whether folks in the community are going to feel that the investigation was properly done and fairly done, being independent. So our unit has averaged for the past 4 years under former Attorney General, now Governor DeWine, and during my tenure, has averaged 35 of these cases a year. We do more than any big city in Ohio. Our folks know what they're doing. They're really good at it. And we have a manual that we follow that has been recognized as a national model. The standards board that the governor mentioned, there are a lot of ways to put this together, a lot of due process safeguards that can be imagined. And I'm committed, and I know the governor is as well, to working with all stakeholders to make sure that this is transparent but also fair to the officers and is going to make our communities safer. I'd like to mention training for officers. We're doing a very deep dive and examining how, not only what we train, which is done before, and frankly we have a pretty good sense of what is done, and I don't know that the syllabus or the list of subjects is terribly deficient. But we're looking at how we do it. We're questioning the underlying assumptions. What do we reinforce in our training? What are the methods of teaching? We have several buckets of things that we need officers to deal with. We have the knowledge base, and that can be done on video and in a classroom. The Fourth Amendment, what is it? When do you need a search warrant? What's an exigent circumstance? Those things can be taught in a classroom format, but then we've got cognitive kinds of things, emotional intelligence, being able to understand what's going on in front of you, be able to identify somebody who might be exhibiting behavior somewhere on the autism spectrum. Somebody might be, as the governor mentioned, having issues with drug or alcohol dependency. Or might be having some sort of mental illness problem. And that calls for a different kind of training because it's not just head knowledge, it's being able to observe and draw real-time conclusions. And the only way to actually do that is in role-playing or simulation kinds of exercises. We probably need to experience and expand those scenario-based training. And then we have the kinetic side, which includes lots of things that don't involve guns. There are lots of non-lethal techniques to bring a situation or a person or persons under control, but those require muscle memory. It's not enough to just teach them in a block for 8 or 16 hours somewhere. It's more like, playing the piano or shooting a basketball. You've got to practice that over and over and over again all the time. So we're going to be looking at how we also instruct on the kinetic arts that go with policing. I reviewed yesterday, went through our simulator out at Opata, and most people think of these as the kind of cardboard, cartoon, shoot, don't shoot scenarios with strobe lights going off. They're much more advanced, and under the former Attorney General, we selected probably the most sophisticated company in the country that does these things with decision trees and multiple outcomes. So there's an operator that's working with the simulator, and the officer is actually giving commands, taking action, placing his body in space, and all those sorts of things. And based on how the officer acts and responds, you have different kinds of outcomes that occur. Some escalate and some don't. I asked the vendor, though, how many people do you have in hoodies? You got 800 and some scenarios. How many of them are wearing hoodies and baggy pants? Or how many of them have tats? Or how many men versus women, black versus white? And he said, and this company serves police departments all over the country, and he said, nobody's ever asked me that before. Now, he promised me the data and new scenarios by August, and I'm really excited about that. But this is what I mean when I talk about doing a deep dive and questioning our assumptions. How are we doing these things, and how can we do them better? I started a Facebook page, Be Heard by the AG. I've been monitoring that page. We've had citizens come in and tell their stories, offer their ideas. And today we published a summary page that you can look at because, social media draws out the best and the worst in our society, and it can be quite a bit trying to wade through that page there's quite a bit of hate on it, frankly. I don't want to censor the hate or the inappropriate remarks. So what we did was we polled the substantive comments into a page that you can read fairly quickly and easily. And I'm proud to report that the measures that the governor and I are announcing today reflect some of the input that we received on that page. We are listening deeply, and we're going to continue to do so. All authority is given for the benefit of someone else. And particularly in a system of self-governance like we have in America, we the people, give the governor, the attorney general, police officers, and everybody else authority to do good for us, to do good for society. Now, I understand that some of the things that we have talked about today are going to be uncomfortable. None of it's going to be easy, and there's going to be substantial discussions and maybe arguments as we go through the legislative process. But I beg my colleagues in law enforcement to remember that the reason you got the badge, the reason that we have authority, is to do good. It's to serve. It's for the benefit of those people. I want every one of you to be safe. I want every one of you to come home to your families. But let's remember that the authority is not for us. It's not for our benefit. It's for the benefit of society. Governor?
Dave, thank you very much. When Dave and I first started talking about these issues, it was, I don't know if it was a surprise, but it was pretty clear to both of us that we had many of the same ideas. And so it's been a good discussion. It's a work in progress. We've reached out to a lot of people. Tom Roberts, NAACP, has been very, very helpful. As I said before, the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus has been very helpful. We've reached out to the Buckeye Sheriffs, the Chiefs of Police. We've reached out to so many other people, the FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, and that process is going to continue. So if we've not reached out to you yet, we're going to, and this is a process. Today's announcements are truly just the beginning. I want to also note that a couple hours ago, the Ohio Mayor's Alliance announced the formation of their new implementation support network for reforming policing practices and rethinking community safety. This network will serve as a platform for cities to share information and policy ideas, customize and implement best practices, track and monitor the impact of policy changes, serve as a vehicle to report on the process of cities' law enforcement. They're taking a holistic approach. I congratulate them on that. We look forward to working with them. Now we'll take questions. Laura.
Good afternoon. It's Laura Bischoff, Dayton Daily News. Governor, do you have a price tag on how much the training, the cameras, the standards boards, all these things are going to cost, and how will you get that done? Are you planning on calling the General Assembly back to session in order to get this done lickety-split? And do you have any indication from legislative leaders that they're on board?
Well, I think the legislative leaders are certainly interested. We've shared the broad outlines with them. I would certainly hope that the legislature will be able to start hearings immediately. These are things that need to be done. Laura, in regard to the cost, we've not calculated the cost out. Some of it is unknown because we have to figure out exactly how many departments, for example, have cameras today. We talked about the police training. We can identify, and we've told you what the police training is going to cost for this year, but we don't have a funding source for the long term. That is not a new problem. It's been something that I wrestled with when I was Attorney General. But my challenge to my friends in the legislature and challenge to myself is we have to find a funding source. Kentucky, for example, has a funding source. I'm not suggesting we use their funding source, but they have a funding source, which simply means people go buy their insurance. Part of that goes into a fund, and that fund is a permanent fund that is used to train their police officers. So we got to find a source to do that. Some of these things are not really that expensive. The reporting, certainly some cost, but the reporting of these incidents is not a very high ticket item. Taking this from a certificate to a license with a licensing board, we believe we can do this under the Ohio Police Officers Training Commission and maybe have a board right under them that does this licensing. Yes, there will be some cost, but this is not going to be a big ticket item. So these are things that need to get done. These are things that have been talked about for a long, long time. None of these ideas, I don't think of one of them, Dave, is something that you and I dreamed up. These are things that have been out there. People have talked about. I've talked about them. The Black Caucus has talked about them. Law enforcement people have talked about them. So it's time for us to do it. It's time for us to get these things done. There is no reason why these issues should not be dealt with. That doesn't mean we've dealt with every problem that we have. But if we can do these things, these are very, very significant steps that will, I think, engender trust, and people will be able to feel that cases are being investigated impartially. They're going to be able to feel that there is accountability. They're going to be able to feel that the system actually will, in fact, work. So I'm very excited about it, and this is something we need to get done.
Adrienne Robbins, NBC4, and my question's for the governor. The Attorney General just said this is not a law enforcement problem, it's a societal problem, and we've truly seen that, especially with the coronavirus. After speaking with the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus, do you support racism being declared a public health crisis, and do you think it is one?
We had a long discussion with that this morning. I told them that I would come back with them after I'd examined the resolution a little more, thought a little bit more, and I promised them an answer. And I will do that, and I promise you the answer. What is not in dispute and should not be in dispute is that we find in society racial disparities. There are disparities not just in regard to health. There are disparities in regard to housing. There are disparities in regard to education and other opportunities. So that is certainly not in dispute. What is incumbent upon all of us, and what I always judge myself by and judge whether we're making progress, is what we get done about it. What are we doing about it? And we've laid out an agenda here today that is an agenda in one area, and one area only, in the law enforcement area. We have laid out a pretty vigorous agenda in regard to health, in dealing with the disparities that we find in health. I laid that out in my State of the State speech, the only one, State of the State, as well as in my inaugural speech, and said that this is a priority of this administration. The coronavirus has brought home, again, it's pulled back the curtain, if we need to have that done, to show, again, disparities based on race. And so these are things we have to fix.
Hi, Rick Ruan from the Columbus Dispatch. Governor, you talked about the ban on chokeholds other than in, I think you said, life-threatening situations. That can be kind of a subjective term. How are you looking at life-threatening situations as we talk about them here, and do you think that the General Assembly needs to define them as part of this?
Well, I think I was stating, I guess I was stating what I thought was obvious, that chokeholds are not good. They should not be used. If a police officer he can take someone's life to protect his life from serious bodily harm or death, I'll turn to my lawyer over here. He can correct me if I'm wrong. And the same way, if he can do that to protect someone else's life. Life is precious. You can only take someone's life to protect that life. So no matter if he was able, for example, or she was able to pull their gun out and shoot the other person, and if that would have been justified, well, it would have been justified to use a chokehold too. I mean, it's. I'm just trying to walk through the logic behind this. But in essence, chokeholds would be banned. Could you have a circumstance for in some case where he or she felt correctly that their life was in danger, they had to take action? If they could have taken lethal action immediately, then they certainly couldn't do anything else that would come under that or be less than that. So don't get hung up on the exception. The rule is don't use chokeholds.
Hello, Governor. Jim Province with the Toledo Blade. This new licensing board that you're talking about creating, would they be able to act retroactively? Could a police officer be brought before them on day one based on prior actions before the board was created?
Well, I would think as a matter of policy that they should be able to. Again, that might be challenged in court. I don't know, Dave, whether you have an opinion about that, but certainly it would operate in the same way that a medical board would. And generally the principle, I think, is that if newly discovered evidence that comes to light, it may have occurred a while ago, but if it bears upon that person's ability to function as a doctor, function as a nurse, function as a teacher, and you now have that information would certainly be available. Dave, you want to comment at all on that?
Well, I agree with you. It would be challenged in court. Generally, ex post facto laws are forbidden. You can't do a law with retrospective prohibitions on conduct. There's an exception in the law for remedial measures, and so I think the governor was actually probably alluding to that exception in his last paragraph. If you could show that the action went to the fitness of the person to serve as a police officer as opposed to merely a bad act that violated current standards, you might be able to have retrospective application. But that's going to be something that would probably involve lawsuits and courts.
Thank you.
Kevin Landers, WBNS 10 TV. Governor, despite the good intentions of what you announced today, there are still African American families in our state who fear every time that their children walk out the door that they're going to be harassed by a police officer or potentially be killed by a police officer. What promises can you give to those families that what you said today will change their belief? And also, would you consider repealing Ohio's body cam laws that currently heavily restrict what videos are made public? Thank you.
I would have to look at that law. I'm not that familiar with it, so certainly something we can look at it. Kevin, I don't think there's any guarantee that any one thing is going to allow people, if they're an African American, to feel totally comfortable. But this is a work in progress. These are things that we can do that matter. And I've always felt that we should not fail to do something just because it wouldn't give us all the relief we wanted, or it wouldn't deal with everything that we want to deal with. My attitude is if we can make progress today, let's make progress today. Let's do things that will give people more confidence, give people more belief in justice. And if we can do that, then we can get that done, and then we need to move on and see what else we can do. Just like this country, life is not perfect, and we have an obligation to do everything we can to fix the problems and work on them every single day. But these are meaningful changes. And these are changes, Kevin, that have been around a long time. We have talked about these things for a long, long time. None of them are new. None of them originated with Mike DeWine or Dave Yost or Phil Plummer or anybody in the legislature. These are ideas that have been around for a long time, and it's time for us to take action. We have it within our power, to the governor's office, attorney general, this legislature, to change these things, and we must do that.
Hi, Governor. Jeremy Pelzer, Cleveland.com. Especially regarding your proposals regarding punishment of police officers or licensing of police officers, changing how that's done. How do you think you're going to run any trouble? Is there any barriers there regarding police unions and collective bargaining agreements? Is that something that you will or lawmakers will have to negotiate with police unions over?
Well, the legislature will do what the legislature is supposed to do, which is to hold hearings. They will hear from people who like our proposal, people who don't like our proposal. They'll probably hear from people who think they can make the proposal better, and they'll probably be right. Look, we don't put this out as perfect. What we're putting it out is these are ideas whose time have come. And the details can be worked out by the legislature through the committee process, which I have a great deal of respect for. And so I'm confident that the legislature will do what the legislature should do, and that is to have a good public discussion. People are going to look at that. I believe, from law enforcement officers who I've talked to and have known for many, many years, going back to when I was an assistant county prosecuting attorney over 40 years ago, that law enforcement officers are professionals. They want other officers to be professionals. They want their profession to be respected, and that they want to get rid of people in their profession, a minority, a small minority, who just shouldn't be police officers. So I think that when officers look at what we're proposing, that due process will be assured all the way through, that they will look at this and think that this is something that is not only fair, but it's a good thing.
Good afternoon, Governor. Dustin Edsinger with Gongwer News Service. In the past, you've expressed skepticism that independent investigations into police-involved shootings would improve public confidence in the process. What's changed your mind?
Well, I don't know if I've had skepticism about it. What I've said, as I recall, is that we certainly, my experience as Attorney General, sometimes we would go in at BCI and do an investigation, and we were an outside agency, but people in some cases still didn't like the results. So that's never going to change. There are going to be people who don't like the results. But what I think is important is that people not be able to think that they can think they didn't like the results, they can think they disagreed with it, but they should have confidence that those who are doing the investigation were independent, that they didn't have an axe to grind, that they were not closely involved or knew the people who were involved. I think those are steps that we can take. Again, it won't make everyone happy, but at least it will be that assurance. One of the things that the Attorney General and I have talked about, and since we both have been Attorney Generals, we sort of had the same experience, is that sometimes BCI coming in to investigate in a particular county may not work. It may not work because BCI has been in there several other times. There may be certain facts. And so the proposal that we both have in our mind, it's going to be up to the legislature how to do it, but is that there's alternative. BCI could certainly do the investigation, but there also could be other independent investigators if for some reason there was a conflict with BCI going into a county, going into a jurisdiction. So it doesn't have to be BCI at all. It certainly can be. They're great investigators, as Dave said, but it could also be another independent investigation. The key is it has to be independent.
Hi, Governor. Noah Belinda with Hannah News Service. I'm wondering if you or the Attorney General have opinions on any changes to the civil liability that a police officer could face for wrongful actions, particularly if you're going to have a new board that will make official determinations that they acted, outside of the scope of what the standards are.
Not really looked at that. You're talking about a civil lawsuit against that particular police officer. Yeah, I have not looked at that, but that's certainly something I'm sure the legislature will take a look at, and there'll be, I would assume, witnesses who will want to talk about that. I've just not looked at that.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ben Schwartz with WCPO in Cincinnati. With a question for either Governor DeWine or Attorney General Yost, whoever feels able to answer. My question, though, is 6 hours of de-escalation training enough for police officers, specifically for dealing with situations involving someone with mental illness or drug dependency? Is today's announcement a first step towards more training, or could we expect it to end here?
Well, I think, again, I'll go back to what I said. Law enforcement officers who I've known throughout my career always want more training. When we look at people with a mental health challenge, which could include, somebody who is, for example, includes a wide range of things. But as Dave said, it could be somebody who is autistic, and knowing how someone who is autistic sees things or hears things, feels things. I mean, it's the training is trying to put that officer in the place of that person who they're coming in contact with. And, we can't get enough of that training, quite candidly. There are some training that's multiple hours in that area where the police officer works with people in the mental health community in the local jurisdiction, so he or she knows what the resources are in that jurisdiction. That is something that is always, we should have more officers who get that kind of training. What we're talking about, at least for the first 6 hours, is to making sure every officer, we got roughly 35,000 police officers in the state of Ohio, some from very small departments, some from departments where they're not getting any additional training each year. We got to make sure that they get this training, and this should be a minimum. Dave?
I concur with that. It's a start. This is in the cognitive bucket that I had talked about earlier and requires, to be effective, in my view, scenario-based training, which is more intensive and more difficult to do. So it's certainly something we need to continue to revisit. I want to caution that I do not speak for the governor here, but it's my personal feeling that the number of hours required for the basic training for a police officer is inadequate. I think that we should be substantially increasing the number of hours required to get the certificate, which is a longer-term solution, but something I certainly am going to be discussing with the legislature.
I agree with the Attorney General on that point as well. As I said, we upped it when I was Attorney General, I think over 100 hours, but it probably needs to go higher. It does need to go higher. Dave also mentioned about scenario-based training. Scenario-based training is basically trying to replicate as close as you can to what that officer feels and sees, senses in a very tough situation and tough environment. By its nature, it's expensive. By its nature, you can't do a whole bunch of people at one time. But again, if we could get a permanent source of funding, which I'm not suggesting what it would be today, but if we could get a permanent source of funding, that scenario type training, you can do more of that scenario training. We started to do some of it when I was Attorney General. Dave has continued that and expanded it. But we frankly need to do a lot more because there's no substitute for actual experience. And you don't want to, the first time an officer has to make a life or death decision, you don't want that to be in reality true. You want it to be in a training exercise that's as close to, can simulate the emotions, the experience as quick as or as well as it can be simulated. So it's important.
2 years worth of lectures about painting and read 75 books about it, but until you've spent time ruining some canvas, you're not going to know how to paint.
Good afternoon, Governor. Jeff Reddick from ABC 6 News in Columbus. You've said several times today that these are proposals that have not only been talked about recently, but over months and years in the past. Can you tell us, though, in the past 2 to 3 weeks, in good faith, who many of the specific people of color are whom you've talked to, in deciding to bring this specific slate of proposals forward?
Who I've talked to? Is that what you said?
Yes, specifically people of color whom you've talked to, Governor or Attorney General.
On several different occasions to the Black Caucus. I have talked to Tom Roberts, as I said. I've talked to my friend Chris Smitherman. I've talked to a number of people, but also so have my team, members of my team. We still have a coronavirus going on, so we're doing a lot of different things at once. But we certainly those would be individuals who certainly I've talked to, and it's an ongoing process, and we're very, very open to people's ideas. But it's interesting that there really has evolved, I think, a consensus of some basic things that need to be done, and that consensus pretty much existed even before the last few weeks, before tragedy in Minneapolis. So none of these proposals should shock anybody. What should shock people is if we don't get them passed this time. Anger, or frustration if we can't get it done. But we can get this done. There's just no reason we cannot get this done. People can talk about, well, I want to change this or that, and that's great. We're open for ideas and suggestions. But these are basic things that we, I think have been talking about. I know we've been talking about for a long time, and there's a real consensus.
Thank you.
Hi, Governor. Andy Chow with Ohio Public Radio and Television State House News Bureau. Thanks for doing this. Part of the call from the anti-racism movement, the protesters out there, they say that law enforcement and the system is structurally racist, such as when an officer uses force because they feel threatened. The officer who killed Tamir Rice felt threatened. The officer who shot and killed John Crawford felt threatened. What do you say to people who believe that the definition of threat is part of the problem? How do you fix that?
Well, Andy, it's complicated. I mean, there's no one that should think that any of this is easy. Ultimately, these matters go before a grand jury. In most cases, they go before people of the community who make a decision about whether that officer was acting reasonably, whether that officer had reasonable fear, and they try to put themselves in the place of that officer. Again, I will go back to something that Dave and I just talked about a moment ago. Nothing is perfect, but the more scenario-based training an officer has, the more they have, the less likely they are to make an error. These are split-second decisions, but many times if you go back and look at some of those cases, the officer was in a wrong position. They were not following the protocol to put themselves in that particular position, what they could see, how they could see it. So this is where training comes in, and training comes in, and training comes in. It doesn't mean there won't be tragedies. Doesn't mean that there won't be misperceptions, but having the officer well trained, but also having in that police department a very specific prescribed protocol that officer knows and understands and is held accountable to. Because when things are happening very quickly, that officer has to be able to go back to their training, but also to the protocol. When I see this, I do this. When I see this, I don't do this. An example, a great example, and it's a topic near and dear to my heart, and that's high-speed chases. You get high-speed chase, and the officer is involved in that, and they become personally involved in it, and they're emotionally involved in it, and that's all understandable. But what has to kick in is there is a protocol. And when the officer sees this, in other words, there's only so many cars that can be allowed in a chase, whatever that protocol is. Whoever's in charge of that chase has the ability to call those officers off. I mean, all of these things, this is where protocol kicks in. And so none of this is easy. We're not saying if we do everything right here that we will not have a tragedy in the future. But our job is to lessen the odds of those tragedies occurring. And the steps that we're talking about today are steps that will truly make a difference.
My name is Deba Uwadia, New Americans Magazine. My question is on training. In your presentation, you talk about officers having the right psychological makeup. My concern is that it's like an attitude when an officer is called to an incident where there's somebody that is of African descent. The kind of energy, in quotes, that the officer will have in handling that situation is always tougher than the kind of energy he will have in handling a situation of somebody that is not of African descent. In the proposal you are having, you are giving the legislature, is there something that we have to address that kind of issue where you don't see, where a police officer will not see an African American as very bad because it's a psychological issue? And not just for the police, the Attorney General talked about society. It's like it's also a societal issue. Do you have in place something that we help the society to also not see the African American that is going through a lonely place as a potential threat to that place? Thank you. And this is the last question.
Thank you for a very, very good question. It goes to certainly a big societal problem. I don't have a great answer or a perfect answer, but one of the things that when I was Attorney General, we increased training and started training actually in this area, and that's implicit bias. Under our proposal, we would make sure that officers get that training, because part of it is for the officer to recognize that they are carrying, we all carry some baggage, we all carry some preconceived notions, we carry some biases, whatever you want to call them, and at least being able to recognize those and try to learn ways to compensate and to recognize and say, yeah, I've got that feeling, I shouldn't have that feeling, or I have this bias, I have this way of looking at things. So, yeah, I mean, that's one thing in regard to police that we certainly can do, but it's not obviously unique to police. It's throughout society. So these are some of the challenges that we continue to face. Thank you, everybody, very much. We look forward to seeing you all. I'll be back here for our regular press conference at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Attorney General Dave Yost, thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor.
For being with us, and we hope you all have a good day. Thank you.